talks about the differences between tenufa and smicha, and the differences were that smicha is done by everybody, but tenufa only has to be done by one person. And the Chumra Tnufa has that it's Nageya, Sai Bar Karban Shoched, Sai Bar Karban Sibur, Sai on live animals. You could do Tnufa and on shechted animals. You don't do Smicha on shechted animals. And you could do Tnufa on breads, and you don't do Smicha on breads. Tanu Rabbanon, starting from the Gemara, 2 lines from the top on Daf Tzadik Daled Amud Aleph. Karbanoi, l'rabbois kol baalei karban l'smicha. That was one of the uses of the word of the 3 words karbanoi that we had on Tzadik Gimel Amud Aleph. That karbanoi tells you that all of the shutfim in a carbon have to make the smicha. Sheyochal, because you could have thought otherwise. V'aloi dinhu umat tenufa shenis rapsa b'shchutin madich tenufa, which even applies to shchutin, unlike smicha, nevertheless, still nismaita b'chayvin. Nevertheless, not everybody who's a shutef in the carbon has to do the tenufa. One could represent everybody else. Smicha shaloi nisrapsa b'shchutin. Smicha, which you cannot do by shchutin, you can only do it by chayin. Surely not everybody should be required to do the smicha. Talmud Loimer Karbanoi. We have a special pasuk, l'rabbois kol baalei karban l'smicha, to tell us that every partner in the carbon has to make smicha. Frek the Gemara, once we've anchored that kol baalei karban l'smicha because of the word karbanoi, well then let's make the kal v'chomer in the opposite direction. V'tis rabba tenufa b'chayvin mikal v'chomer. Let's make a kal v'chomer to be mechayiv every individual partner in the carbon with tenufa, because umas smicha shaloi nisrapsa b'shchutin. Madich smicha, where you don't even do it on a dead animal, only on a live animal. Nevertheless, nisrapsa b'chayvin, everybody who's involved in that carbon has to make smicha. Tenufa should nisrapsa b'shchutin. Tenufa, which applies across the board, even by shchutin, ein aydin shenisrapsa b'chayvin. Surely everyone involved in the carbon should have to make the tenufa. Zok Gemara, your argument is good, but there's a technical difficulty. Mishum deloy efshar. It's impossible for multiple people to do one tenufa. Heichi liyavit. How exactly should you do it? Linfi kulu bahade adodi. If everyone tries to do it together, kahavi chatzitza. One person's hands will be right on the carbon, but the other shut of his hand will be underneath that shut of his hand. So he won't be touching it directly. There'll be a chatzitza, won't be a good tenufa. And if you want to suggest leinif v'leihader v'leinif, let each one do it on their own, one after the other. That wouldn't be appropriate either, because tenufa, a single tenufa, amar rachmana v'loi tenufais. Beautiful kasha, beautiful kasha. Zokt Rashi, nismaita b'chayvin, echad meiniv kedem afarish mishum dolo yefsher mishum dehava chatzitza ben yad shel zeh lekarbon. Frekt Rashi dovis kasha vikasha ha'aminon kayin meniach yadei tachas yad bailim umeiniv v'havi yad chatzitza. There, the bailim's hands will be chatzitza to the kayin. Zokt Gemara lo ikbid. There's not a problem. Mishum the ikar tenufa b'bailim k'dichsiv al kapei hanazir. The main chiyuv for tenufa is on the bailim. His chayvus of the kohen to do the tenufa is not a chayvus for the tenufa, it's his participation in the tenufa of the bailim. But the bailim has a primary responsibility, therefore each one of the bailim would have to be, his hands would have to be directly touching the carbon. Zog to Gemara Vayter. Smicha b'shchutin lasa. One fact that you assume is a fact is that you could never do smicha on a non-live animal. But that's not true, because Vatanan, we learned in the Mishnah, now we know the Kohen Gadol has the right to jump in and claim the right to any avodah. Any avodah he wants to do, he has a right to do. So Bisman Kohen Gadol writes lahaktir. What if the Kohen Gadol decided that he wants to do the haktaras of the emurin of the Tamid Shel Shachar? So she would walk up the ramp, and he'd have his shamish on his right hand. He when he got halfway up, the skan will hold his right hand, and he will, I guess, help them up. He shouldn't slip. And then the Mishnah lists off, I believe there's 12 kohanim that are required to fulfill the process of the Talmud Shel Shachar. And there was one person who was designated to bring the Rosh and the Regel to the Mizbeach. So he could intercept, and he could tell that fellow, don't put it on the Mizbeach. I'll take that from you. So then the Kohen Gadol will be Soimech Halein, will do Smicha on the Rosh and the Regel, Vizarkan, and he'll put that on the Mizbeach. And then we don't have the second guy who's bringing the Shtei Yadayim. He doesn't hand it directly to the Kohen. It's more respectful if there's only one person that's dedicated to handing items to the Kohen. So therefore, the second in line will pass his Shtei Yadayim to the Kohen Gadol, Noit to the Kohen Gadol, and again, Soimech Halein V'Zarkan. Nishmer Hasheni, the second Kohen who brought the Shtei Yadayim, could now go out of the way, go home. The halachlai, and he leaves. The third guy as well comes, hands it to the first guy, and then the first guy hands it off to the Kohen. But in each case, soimech aleim, the Kohen Gadol makes smicha on the limbs, v'zarka. V'zman writes, who soimech v'cheim zarkin. Not only that, the Kohen Gadol could just do smicha and have somebody else put it on to the mizbeach. So you see clearly an illustration of smicha even on limbs. Abaye, that doesn't have a din smicha to be mekayin the ischayvus of smicha. Hasa mishum kvoidi the Kohen Gadol. I guess it was respectful for the Kohen Gadol, as Rashi says, she'nira kemoi shehikrafu eskulan, in order to make it look like he was mark of them all. Hoya soimech alayim, he'd made smicha. But that's avad, not a technical smicha. It's just an action to give the Kohen Gadol respect. Okay, Baruch Hashem, we finished the 10th parak of Menachos, Shtei Midos, B'lineder Hadin Lach Shtei Midos, B'lineder Hadin Lach Shtei Midos, B'lineder Hadin Lach Shtei Midos. Zok the Heilige Gemara Vater, Shtei Halachem. The Shtei Halachem were the two breads that were brought on Shavuos. So I guess we could say it'll bring the strikes again because we're coming up to Shavuos. Niloishois achas achas. They don't bake one big bread or knead one big dough and then make it into two breads. Rather, each bread, from the construction of the dough, when they mix the flour and the water, it's already separated at that point. Each lisha is dedicated to one bread, and then they're baked that way. The nefos achas achas. The lechem aponim, on the other hand, are niloishois achas achas, but the nefos shtayim shtayim. They're baked two at a time, and they're all in from psukim. Uvitfus hayaisais, and we know that the lechem aponim wasn't just a flat bread or a loaf; it was folded over. We're all familiar with that shape, and we're going to get into great detail today as to precisely what the shape of the lechem aponim was. But it had to be made in some type of form to give it its form. When he took him out of the oven, they placed it into a form, so it shouldn't fall apart. You know, it stuck up and folded over. By keeping it in a form, it would protect it from falling apart. Okay. Now, there was a discussion in Tosfos, when we say it was in a form, it could be inside a form, or it could be formed, it could be put over a form. Either way, it would give a dough its shape. So Tosfos has a little bit of a discussion. Was it placed into a form, or was it placed over a form? So basically, was the form on the outside of the bread, or was the form on the inside of the bread? Okay. Then we have another Tosfos that talks about Kishur Roidan Noiston Litfus Kedei Shalo Yiskalkalu. So What are these defus? Zoktoisus heina kairos shel shulchan. These were the actual pans that actually held these breads while they were on the shulchan. Kida Omar kairos of elu defusin. V'chein pirush Rashi b'perush chumash shal yonois noi b'kairos le'achar afiyah. There's so Frank Toisvis Vitema had the pligi lekamon. We're going to have a machlokes later, which we actually had discussed earlier in the Masechta. Ba'afiyos on nidachi Shabbos. Can you bake the lechem aponim on Shabbos? The Gemara says you could bake it on Shabbos. You know why? The Lamanda Amar Tanur Mekadesh. If you hold that the lechem becomes kedushas aguf in the tanur, because that's the first clay shores that the lechem aponim is placed into, then it would have to be doiche Shabbos. Mishum di afila me'esmol, if you already gave the lechem upon kedushas aguf on Friday, well then if salabelina, it would be possibelina. So it must be that it had to bake it on Shabbos itself. Ulamandamar ain't tanner mekadosh, but if you held that the tanner does not make the lechem upon kadosh, so then you could bake it before because it wouldn't have yet taken on its kedushas aguf in the baking process. Therefore, loidachi. The problem, Zaktoisvis, is if you're going to put it into a form anyway, habein lamar ubein lamar ka'aros niskachu. Everybody holds that those pans became kodesh kedachsiv b'pashus nasoi u'mashach deboy es oil moed v'saroin edus es hashulchan v'es kol kelaf. So regardless, even if you didn't bake it in the klishars, if you took it out of the oven and you put it right into these pans, as the Mishnah says here, so it should protect its form, so it's going to become kedushas aguf as well. So weiter, you should not be able to bake it on Friday because shalom is calculated because it needed support; it could break. Yeah, it would still be able to break because challah it doesn't go up and over. It's just a loaf. A loaf won't fall apart, but if it's built with a whole structure, it could fall apart. So Zok to Gemara, Zok to Shema, maybe you could say, Avagav dechsiv gabe shulchan, v'asisa kairoisov, mikamochim klei shulchan loy mikru. Maybe these pans were not included in those in the kalim of the shulchan that are made into a klisharis. So that's what Tosfos has a discussion how that works. Tosfos says maybe there were forms that they were stored in, not necessarily the ones that they were put on the shulchan with, but that's a discussion of what these pans were. How do we know the halacha of how these were baked? And for the echad, for shtayim, the tanur rabbanan shnei esroinim yiyah hachala ha'echas. Each challah should be 2 esroinim. This is the pasuk by the shtei alechem. Let's look at it inside. It says, "V'lakachta soiles v'fisa oisa." Shtei mesri chalosh, shnei esroinim yiyah hachala ha'echas. My mistake. It's talking about the lechem aponim. Each one of the lechem aponim was shtei esroinim. Shnei esroinim yiyah hachala ha'echas. Melamed. This teaches us sheni loishois achas achas. If it says shnei esroinim yiyah hachala ha'echas, meaning when they were made lechatchila, they were made with 2 esroinim of soilus. Minayin she'af shtei alechem kach. This pasuk is about the lechem aponim. How do you know this applies to the shtei alechem? By the shtei alechem, there was actually 1 isora in per challah. But how do you know that the dough was already made in separate batches, 1 for each of the shtei alechem? Talmud Lomer yiyah, by the lechem aponim it says shnei esrodim yiyah. That yiyah is teaching us, even though it's mentioned by lechem aponim, it's teaching us halacha by shtei alechem. And how do you know that the lechem aponim was baked 2 at a time? Talmud Loimar v'samta oisom, place them. V'samta oisom shtayim marachos sheisha mareches ala shulchan atar lefnei Hashem. It was placed in 2 rows. Each row was 6 high. But since it says oisom, it tells us that they were baked together. Yochel av shtei alechem kein. You might think that just like we learned from lechem aponim to shtei alechem, that each one is needed independently, maybe huadin, the same halacha should apply by shtei alechem as applies by lechem aponim, that 2 breads are baked together. Talmud Loimer oisam. Frek to Gemara, hi oisam ha fikte. You just used it to teach us the halacha that by lechem aponim there's two baked together. You can't use that same word as a miyut to exclude the shtel lechem. Sagt Gemara, I have two available limudim here because imkein lemakra v'samtom. It could have said v'samtom, and then I would have known that you bake two of the lechem upon them together. My v'samta oisam, that gives us an extra limud that we can use to exclude the shtel lechem shemat minei tarti. Taner Rabbanan, v'samta oisam b'tfus. You put them into a form. Zok the Gemara, shloisha defusim hein. There were three forms. Noisna l'tfus v'adayin hibatzek. When it was merely in the dough stage, it was placed into a form. Uchim in the fus hoya lo betaner. Then it was put into some type of form in the tanner, and this is the tfus that Tosfos speculates. Was it placed into the tfus in the tanner or on the tfus? And the reason why Tosfos raises this is because roida minatanur normally means it's stuck to the side of the oven and you scrape it off. If it's in a what's it called for it? A baking pan, there's nothing to scrape off. So therefore, if it was put over a baking pan, then you could scrape it off the baking pan. Uchashu roida, and then when you took it out, noisna b'tfus, you put it into a third tfus, kedei shaloitis kalkal, so that it shouldn't fall apart. Frag the Gemara, ulahadra l'tfus kama. Why did you just put it back into the original form? Why did you need a separate form to put it back into? Put it into the form that it wasn't before. Zok the Gemara, kivin the afila nafcha. Because what's going to happen is it's going to blow up. When it bakes, it rises, and it won't fit into the tfus anymore. So this is one of the places where it's being derived from. If it was baked in a pan, no matter where it rises up, it can't rise out, it's kept into a pan. So why can't you put it into that same pan? LMI, that's what it says, it might be speaking where the tfus is underneath the challah, and then the challah can grow, and that's why it won't fit into the original tfus. Itmar, lechem aponim keitzad oisin oisoi. How was the lechem aponim made? As you can see from all these pictures and diagrams, it is a bit complicated. Rab Chanina Amar Kimin Teva Prutza. That's the image that we have in our minds of what the lechem aponim looked like. Pointing to this picture, it was like a Teva Prutza. So this is what we're worried of. These side walls could fall over. So that's why if they're in a pan, there's some level of support for it. So this is the Pashati way most people look at lechem aponim. There are some that have pictures where it folds over again and it folds over the inside section. But this is the basic Teva Prutza. That's what Reb Chanina says. But Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kemin Svina Roikedes, like a racing ship in the ocean where it comes to a point. Now here is where there's a big discussion in the Rishonim. From Rashi, it's mashma that not only on either end did it come into a point, but if you looked at the front of the ship, you'll see the whole side of the ship also came to a point. So everything comes to a point. A canoe, for instance, is flat on the bottom, but each end comes to a point. So there's actually a discussion between Rashi and Tosfos. The center of the boat or the lechem aponim that was in the shape of a canoe, was that flat or was it pointy all the way across? So there is a discussion about that. That's what this long Tosfos is about. So he discusses this V that is in Rashi. Is that looking at the top of the ship down, and this is what it looks like? Or is it looking at the front of the ship and the whole shape of the ship comes down to a point? That's a little bit of a discussion, and it'll be relevant to some of the Gemara's kashas. So Zog to Gemara, Rabbi Yochanan Amar Kemin Svina Roikedes, Bishlam Laman Amar Kemin Teva Prutza, Hainu Dahave Yosy Bezichen. They had beziche levoina, little containers of levoina that were placed on the lechem aponim. If it was teva psucha, there's a flat surface in the lechem aponim where you could place them. There was no flat surface. Where would they put these beziche levoina? Heicha v'yasfei bezichen. That's kasha number one. And for the Gemara, makoim ovid lahu. They made a little bit of a carve out in it. Here, there's a little bit of a picture. We have a picture maybe them Sifta Gemara, but they carved out of the wall of the ship a little indent where the lechem where the baziche levoina might fit into. Okay, so that was challenge number one. We're going to have a series of challenges. Now there were three pipes that went across the top of the lowest lechem upon, and that created the airspace between each of the lechem upon from one to the other. So if it was kiminteva, there's a good surface to put the rods, and then you could put another lechem upon them on top of it. But the problem is, if you're going to make it kamin savina, well, we have a problem because if you look at how it looks over here, this would be held stable because it has a wide surface to hold that rod up. But the ones at the end are just going to flop over because they're only supported by a small point in the middle. This is negate to that shaila I mentioned earlier, because the one that's on top of this, if it's just all a point, it's also going to flop over. But if it's flat in the center, then it won't flop over. That's part of what Tosfos discusses in whether or not it was pointed all the way across. But Al Kalponim, how did the three rods stay in place? They wouldn't be able to balance on the 2 points and the end. So bishtam lamandam kamin teva prutza hainu davi Yosy konim. Lamandam kamin tzvina rekedes konim hechi havi Yosy. And for the Gemara, mursha ovid lahu. What they did was they had to build out of the sides in the front a piece of dough sticking out this way and a piece of dough sticking out that way, and the same thing on this point. So now it was a little pieced together. It was like patched together because they are now adding little pieces to the bread to create some type of support for these kodim. So Zok to Gemara, Mursha Obadu. Zok to Gemara, Kasha number 3. Bishlam Lamadama Kaminteva Prutza, Haini Disamchi Leis Nifin Lalechem. Now the lechem upon him took up the full width of the shulchan, which was 5 tefachim. Now there were 2 boards that were sandwiched on either side of the shulchan that went all the way up to the side, meaning the lechem upon them, as they're piled up, are sort of supported by those boards that go up the side because they're squeezed precisely in between those 2 sides. So bishlam lamanda omar kimin teva perutza hani samchele snifin lalechem. The snifim, these sideboards, would have provided some support to the lechem upon them. Elaman Omar Kimin Svina Rekedes. If it was Kimin Svina Rekedes, Heiki Samchalas Nifin Lechem. They barely touched the side wall because it's only at the top point. See, for this question, it's very relevant. Was the bottom flat? Because if it was pointed, if the bottom was flat, then this kasha is only a kasha if the breads lied perpendicular to the table where there was a point on either side. But if it was the other way and the center was flat, this kasha wouldn't be sure. So the way this was set up was the 2 points of the bread. One was touching one snip and one was the other. But if you hold this pointing all the way down, then no matter what, there's no place where the board is going to provide support other than the very top. So this is where you would see it in greater contrast. You see, it's only touching here and over here. So the boards aren't really providing much of a support. Here, they're down the whole side. Here, they're providing a much more significant support. So Zog to Gemara, and for the Gemara, the Ogolumi Agol. You know what they did? They actually built cradles. Off the sideboards, there were cradles on either side that cradled the lechem. Like this picture here. There was actually a cradle coming out of each of the 2 sideboards to cradle it. Here you can see what it looks like without the lechem. There's a cradle connected to each sideboard, and with the hole in the middle that's properly tapered to the shape of the lechem upon them. So they were cradles, and that's how it was held up. Elamandama come in, tzinu rekedes hechi sam chilei, snifin alechem, the agolumi agol. So now let's look at something else. If you have this configuration, then there is no room on the shulchan to hold up these boards because the breads fill up the whole shulchan. So the boards had to go down to the floor to be supported because there was no place on the shulchan where you could place them. But if you held that the breads were not flat at the bottom and there were cradles underneath them, then technically the snifim on either side didn't have to rest on the floor. They could have rested on the actual tabletop underneath the two sides of the ship, which are raised because it's tapered up. So there's room there to put a support. So Zog to Gemara, Bishlam Lamand Omar, Kemen Svina Rekedes, Hanyu de Beinon Snifin. That's why you had Snifin. El Lamand Omar Kemen Teva Prutza, Snifin Lama Li. So I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. This is not what this kasha is. So Bishlam Lamand Omar Kemen Svina Rekedes, Hanyu de Beinon Snifin. That's why we need. I'm sorry?
That's why you need support.
That's right. Elamanda Omer Kementeva Perutza, if it's Kementeva Perutza, Snifin Lamali, why would they need any support at all? They're not going to fly over. So Kumar Agav Yukur the Lechem, the Lechem, if you pile 6 up on top of each other, they're going to crush. They're heavy. Tlach. So therefore, you needed support because when the weight of one that goes on the other one, the wall could cave in. So if you keep it supported tight on either side, the wall would not cave in.
Support for each one on top.
I'm sorry?
On the bottom one had support.
You mean on the bottom?
Who had the support? Just the bottom?
The two sniffing went up the sides. So it was sandwiching the sides into the shulchan. So they couldn't collapse and fall out. Right? Because there's a vertical section. The concern that we have about collapse, if you're piling multiples on top of each other, the weight of the top breads would crush these sides and push them out. But if you have a wall on either side, now these things can't fold out.
You have these walls made up. Bread's gonna crush.
Yeah, it was heavy. I'm
talking about these forms that are rounded.
The Gemara says if you had those forms, then I understand why they needed support because they'd fall over without the support. But if it's Kavinteva Pruta, why did they need any support at all? Just pile one up on top of the other. What was the whole purpose for these supports?
I understand that. Separate question. These forms that they made was only for the bottom lechem?
No, they were for all of them.
In between each one.
Yeah, if you look at this picture that's in the original Rashi, you could see there's the sniffing that are coming out under each lechem. So each lechem was cradled. So Zok to Gemara, Elamana Mekimenteva Pruta Snifin Lamli. Zok to Gemara, Agav Yukur the lechem tlach. The weight of one bread sitting on top of the other bread would crush it. Zok to Gemara, Bishlam Laman Domar, Kimin Svina Rekedes, Snifin al Gabe Shulchan Munocha. This is what I was referring to. Now the snifin could be placed right on the table because underneath these boats where it gradually points towards the center, there's some tabletop space that's uncovered that you could rest this snifin upon. However, there's no place whatsoever, there's no room on the surface of the shulchan to rest these supports. So snifin heicha manachlu, they went down to the ground. Are you going to tell me they went down to the ground? Zakamarin, Damar Ababa by Mamal, Ludivri Oimer, Kamin, Savina Rekedes, Snifin Al Gabe Shulchan Munachin. But Ludivri Oimer, Kamin Teva Perutza, Snifin Al Gabe Karka Munachin. Why is what? Why did the Gemara consider that unusual? They go to the ground. I guess because we're assuming everything's on the shulchan. It departs from the pashtus that there was an external structure, an external support structure built around the shulchan. No, but it would be logical to say that you piled the bread up on the shulchan. Now, what we're saying is there was the shulchan, and then besides the shulchan, there was a completely separate external skeleton that was supporting things. I think that's a departure from what the simplest approach would be. I understand, but that's true. The shulchan had legs that went down to the ground, but but where were the supports? We know that there were supports on either side of the lechem. What holds them up? You could ask, what's the big deal? So it doesn't have to be on the tabletop. Bolt it down underneath. I guess it didn't work that way. But these were all xeris akosovs, I guess. Actually,
The Wagner made it
flat because he goes like the other shot. Actually, there's a Tosfos about it. I think this Tosfos also mentioned something about how there was a machloikus of how the lechem aponim was made. So it seems like the halacha of the lechem aponim, everybody agrees the way it was done. The question really is what the minig was, how they did it, but it wasn't a question of the halacha how it had to be done. I saw that, I believe, somewhere in Tosfos. Let's see if we get to it. But let's continue on to finish up the daf. Zog to Gemara, Kaman Oslo. The following brisa that we're about to quote, who would be the author of it? Hadam Rabbi Yehuda, Halechem Maibid es hasnifin. The bread holds up the snifin. Vasnifin mamidim es halechem. So this is like they had a symbiotic relationship. They both leaned on each other. I remember my shver when he was 99 years old and he walked to shul. He had a partner who lived next door with whom he walked to shul with, who was 100 years old. So this is a 99-year-old man walking to shul with a 100-year-old man, and they were both leaning on each other. They had a symbiotic relationship. One without the other would never have made it. So that's how this nifim worked with the lechem aponim. So command Omar, kamin svina rekedes. It must be that it's going according to the mandamar who says svina rekedes. Why? What's the question? So let's have a look inside Rashi. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to mention that as we started this parak, we had a little bit of a transition. We no longer have a regular Rashi and Ksav Yad Rashi. Here, the little note says, from here on, it's real Rashi. So we only have one Rashi now. So let's have a quick look at what the Gemara says. Snifin, here it is. Alechem maimer snifin, sheshipua shalechem munach al kipulei shal snif. The slope of the lechem sat on the area, on the cradle of the snif. The snif mamir halechem shelo yipol. So the bread puts force against the cradle to stabilize them somewhat, and the wall, the snifim, gives stability to the breads. But if you hold that it's Kementeva Perutza, the snifim are not really supporting the breads. If anything, the breads are supporting the snifim. I hope that's shot. If it's Teva Perutza, they're not supporting each other. So what is it? So the way I understood is that the breads aren't being supported, or maybe to sniffing that aren't being supported. I'm not sure which one is not supporting, but it's not a symbiotic relationship. Let me see if the ArtScroll says which one is not being supported. Let's have a look and see what the ArtScroll says. According to this view, the bread secures the prop from above, while the prop supports the bread from below. But the other way around, let's only look at 12, but the other way around, the curved wall of the loaf presses down upon the semicircle of the prop, thereby holding it in place, while the prop keeps the bread from toppling over. But if it was Teva Prutza, it's not clear what would be. It seems like maybe they're both independent, because neither one is putting pressure on the other one. Or maybe we still have the sniff supporting the breads, because we learned that the purpose of those sniffing is the bread shouldn't break, right? So maybe the sniffing is supporting the bread, but the bread's not supporting the sniff. Maybe that's what the Gemara is saying. Does that make sense? Okay, Zog the Gemara weiter. Meisvei. Gemin kaveras hayola betaner. There was a something in the shape of some type of a round container, which Rashi says that's referencing Vazat Fus. This was the pan Shahu Nefa boy that it was that it was baked in. Meruba, it was square. V'hainu k'minteva perutza sheyesh la shulayim rechavim u'merubayim. Its floor was the full surface area of the bread. So basically, kimin kaveres hoyala b'tanur, v'doima kimin tavla merubas. It basically looked like a square pan. So if it looked like a square pan, clearly that is the teva prutza, not the kimin svina. Zakt Gemara, ema ufia doima kimin tavla merubas. Say that not that the whole pan was in a square, the top of it was, but the bottom of it was gradually narrowed to a point. Tanya Kamanda Amar Kaminsvina Rakedes, the Tanya Arba Snifin Shalzov, Hayu Sham, Mifutsalim, Meirashayem, Kemin Dakronim Hayu. They were I think this means they stuck out underneath the breads. Shesaimchen Behenes Halachem, Shudaima Kemin Svina Rakedes. So here the Bride says specifically that the breads of the Lechem Aponim were like a svina rekedes. So you have a brayso that clearly says that that's how the lechem aponim was, svina rekedes. I believe the shaila is they asked on this Gemara. It seems like that's the conclusion of the Gemara, that it was svina rekedes. But if that's the case, why do we naman that it was always flat? So one of the Mefarshim say that the machlokes is not what there really was. The machlokes is halachically what would be appropriate, what you could do. But lemaisa, what they might have done was this. Okay, let's stop here, and we will be mamshah tomorrow.